Hello, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Socialist Equality Group New Zealand. This meeting's title is For a Socialist Program Against the New Zealand Labour Government's Right-Wing Agenda. I am Matt Carrington, a member of the SEG and the chair of this meeting. The Labour government is beginning its term under the shadow of a democratic crisis in the United States. Whoever assumes the White House, this crisis will not go away and there will be no return to normal. It will also have a profound impact, not just in the United States, but in every country, including New Zealand. The world economy and the fracturing of interglobal relations bear down on every government. No country can isolate from this world situation, no matter how much they purport to do so. Ardern's mantra, New Zealand is a peaceful oasis in a world of chaos, could not be further from the truth. Behind the facade of stability is an economic and strategic crisis of historic dimensions. Nobody should imagine that a Biden presidency in the United States will ease global tensions or reduce the risk of fascism. Rather, it will push an aggressive and pro-war foreign policy abroad. At the same time, the far-right base that Trump has built will not evaporate and threatens to emerge as a fully fascist movement that the ruling class can use to smash the working class as it struggles against capitalist exploitation. Our three speakers today will draw out that New Zealand is in no way isolated from these dangers. They will debunk the propaganda that Ardern's government represents a kinder, gentler capitalism, capitalism with a human face. In fact, the Ardern government has already overseen vast increases in social equality, while strengthening its ties with US imperialism. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Comrade Cheryl Crisp, who is the National Secretary of the Australian Socialist Equality Party, who will talk about the global impact of the 2020 US election.
Thanks, Maddie. And I'd very much like to welcome all the participants in this meeting today. As Maddie said, we have called a meeting to discuss the outcome of the New Zealand elections and the tasks confronting the working class. But it isn't possible to deal with the events in New Zealand without addressing the situation internationally and particularly in the United States. These are conditions of unprecedented and historic crisis of the capitalist system, and it is expressed most sharply in the US. The 2020 US election, one like no other in US history, has now been called for Biden and the Democrats. More than 160 million people it's estimated, will have voted by the time of the finishing of the count. This is an almost 67% turnout, higher than any time in the last 120 years. And a truly extraordinary situation now exists, where Biden has polled more than 75 million votes, more than 4 million over that of Trump, and likely to end up with possibly 7 million more than Trump. Trump, who remains the president for another 72 days until the inauguration, refuses to concede defeat and is undertaking legal action to dispute the legitimacy of the election. His ramming through of the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett into the Supreme Court was in preparation for this. He has doubled down on his narrative of the stolen election, the stab in the back, which of course he has made central to his campaign in the last number of months of the election campaign itself, in order to mobilise his base. Our party in the US, the Socialist Equality Party, described the elections as a civil war election. It has been characterised by the threats by Trump to bring the troops onto the street and establish dictatorial forms of rule in response to the mass demonstrations against the murder of George Floyd. Plots by fascist militia groups uncovered to kidnap and murder sitting state governors, plots which were hailed by Trump. Open declarations that the pandemic will be allowed to rage through the population, irrespective of the cost in human life. And of course, just recently, the threats to behead Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Now, while amongst international leaders and governments, there is something of a sigh of relief at Biden's victory, for the working class, absolutely nothing will be resolved by the installation of a Democratic president. The vote for Biden was predominantly a vote against Trump, against the death and destruction overseen by his administration from the pandemic, the attacks on immigrants, on jobs, on living conditions, and on democratic rights. But this was not a vote of confidence in the program of Biden, because he didn't outline one. Other than wearing masks, the Democratic Party has elaborated no perspective for dealing with the virus or its impact socially and economically. There is no program for jobs or wages. In fact, a Biden administration will be one of austerity, militarism, censorship, and the continued attack on democratic rights. It also has to be stated that the 70 million people who voted for Trump are not fascists, they're not supporters of capitalism. There are certainly layers within his base who are, as expressed by those who were exposed as preparing for the kidnapping of Whitmer and the Virginia governor, who are certainly extreme right-wing and fascists. But the vast majority of the 70 million who voted for Trump, workers, rural workers, are layers who have been profoundly affected by the crisis, by unemployment, by poverty, by the pandemic, and who see nothing on offer from the Democrats. They have been extremely confused and disoriented by the outpourings of Trump and the proposition that he puts forward that he is not part of the political elite, he is not a politician, and is somebody that they can relate to. And I think it is important because there will be, particularly amongst pseudo-lefts, amongst those in Jacobin, Socialist Alternative, who see within the vote racism within the white working class and really blame the white working class for the fact that the Democrats received such a narrow win despite the polls. And I think it's also important because the fact that neither the Democrats nor the media networks called the election in Biden's favour either yesterday or the day before, despite the fact that he had clearly won both the popular vote and the Electoral College votes, is because behind the scenes, feverish and intensive discussions with the Republicans and major businesses were being held about the makeup of his cabinet and his program. In fact, Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, has assumed virtual veto powers over Biden's cabinet. So while 75 million people could vote for Biden, in fact, they get McConnell. What is being prepared is a form of national unity administration. What Biden has presented in all the speeches that he has delivered since the election is one of patience, that I will rule not for the blue states, not for the red states, but for the United States. I will rule for those who didn't vote for me. What he was raising, what he is putting forward is an administration which will have most probably Republican participants in it, and one in which the Republicans will have an enormous input into both the perspective, the program, the economic program, and the makeup of the administration. And in fact, in the course of the election campaign, Biden has constantly underplayed Trump's threat to not accept the election result if he lost. He has also covered over the fascist gangs being mobilised by Trump and the plots to kill members of Biden's own party. The reason for their silence is because the Democrats fear these revelations could trigger working class opposition to them. They fear far more the movement of workers and young people than they do a Trump fascist coup. So if they can't and won't defend members of their own party, certainly they are not going to defend the working class, either the lives or the democratic rights of workers. And in fact, the character of this administration has been highlighted by the statements of one of the CIA Democrats, Abigail Spanberger, who in fact was a CIA agent. And she declared in what was an angry outburst in a hookup with her cohorts. And as she said, never again should we allow the word socialist or socialism to be spoken in the Democratic Party. And it is particularly significant that both the Republicans in the form of Trump and the Democrats have identified who their real enemy is, who they really have to deal with, and it's not each other, but socialism. And it's why the fear of a movement of the working class, and one which could break free of the stranglehold of the unions, of the Democratic Party, is something which they hold in such dread. And so, in fact, the turn by the Democrats to work with the Republicans, the declaration that Biden made, that our opponents are not our enemies, is really a mirror of the role that they played during the Trump presidency. There has been bipartisan support for every measure carried out against the working class, with the sole exception of foreign policy. The Democrats in Congress supported the passing of the CARES Act, which transferred trillions of dollars from the public purse to business. The result is surging bank profits. Morgan Stanley's profits have increased by 25% since last year. Goldman Sachs's profits doubled. Since the end of February, Jeff Bezos, owner of Amazon, has increased his net worth by close to $80 billion. Meanwhile, 10% of the adult population in America cannot afford to buy food. Almost half are struggling to meet household expenses and bills, and 20% of households cannot afford medical care in the midst of a pandemic. The fact that the share markets have risen with the prospect of a Biden presidency is because Biden and the Democrats are a known quantity, and they're trusted by the ruling elites. Let's not forget that Biden was the vice president during the 8-year reign of Obama, during which the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich took place. Obama was the deporter-in-chief of immigrants and the president who organised international assassination programs, including against American citizens. Biden and the Democratic Party are the party of Wall Street, the military, and the intelligence agencies. They offer no alternative to Trump's murderous policy and administration. They have no program to meet the crisis of the pandemic outside of masks. They have no substantial difference with the Republicans on domestic policy. The only difference is on the question of foreign policy, and that is an anti-Russia narrative and what their role in the Middle East should be. So we are not witnessing a rebirth of American democracy. And there are already those, as I said, in the pseudo-lefts, in Jacobin, the DSA, and their satellites internationally, including Socialist Alternative, declaring that while Biden may not be everything that we want, he is preferable to Trump. That this is an administration which can be pressured, that a Biden administration provides breathing space to campaign and regroup, Nothing could be more mistaken. If Trump at present does not have political support from the ruling class and the military for the dictatorial forms of rule that he threatened, it is not because that option is being dispensed with completely. What they hope for, what the breathing space that the bourgeoisie hopes for, is a disorientation as a result, within the working class, as a result of a democratic presidency. It is in fact for the ruling class that such a breathing space is necessary. But whether Trump or whoever replaces him, or the Republicans, the right-wing forces and militia in the military, whether the sections of the ruling class turn towards a dictatorial and fascist form of rule, will be determined in struggle. That is not something which is preordained. That will be bound up with the ability of the working class to turn towards, to understand and accept a revolutionary and socialist perspective. And that is in particular bound up with the role of the International Committee and the Socialist Equality Parties. Now, it has to be raised that the US election has coincided with a very grim milestone. Internationally, 50 million people have been infected with COVID-19 and more than 1.2 million dead. There are now 1 million infections being recorded worldwide every 36 to 40 hours, and almost 10,000 deaths daily. The US infection rate hit a daily height yesterday of 132,540. This is 165% higher than the previous high in July. The United States, the richest country on earth, the most powerful imperialist nation in the globe, which comprises 4% of the world's population, has now 20% of its world infections. And with almost 250,000 dead, more than 20% of deaths. The virus is without a doubt a highly infectious and deadly one, but the death toll in the United States and internationally is not an act of nature, but the result of conscious and deliberate decisions by governments, including the Trump administration and every other capitalist government. We have described the pandemic as a trigger event, analogous to that of the outbreak of World War I. World War I ended not because of decisions of the capitalist antagonists, not because of the desire for peace, but because of the intervention of the working class, most notably the Russian Revolution of 1917. It is that task which now confronts the working class internationally today. The US election has only exposed the utter inability, disinterest of capitalism and their representatives to deal with this crisis. Both capitalist parties in the United States, Democrat and Republican, stand indicted as a result of their response to the pandemic. But so do the Liberals here, Labor, as well as National and the Labor Party within the United States. All of them approach the pandemic from the standpoint not of saving of lives, but of saving of profits and saving of the economies. And so these forces who in New Zealand rushed to the defence of Jacinda Ardern, in the United States to Biden, and internationally to different political regimes. Their role, their aim is to ensure that the independent mobilisation of the working class, independent of these nationalist and reformist and capitalist organisations and parties, do not take place. The Democratic Party itself campaigned on a racialist and identity politics narrative. And this is the political perspective of all the pseudo-lefts. That narrative is one which is designed to divide workers, to pit workers against each other. Their position is that it is not race which is the divide under capitalist society, but race. It is not class, sorry, which is the divide, but race. And the outcome of such a position, of such a political perspective, is division and the fracturing of the working class, the prevention of the unification of workers, both within the United States and internationally. They promote the fallacy, the lie, that Biden is a lesser evil, and as the lesser evil, that he has to be supported. No, workers have to fight for their own independent perspective. There must be a break with the opportunist politics that these organisations promote. The SEP candidates in the United States of Joseph Kosher for president and Narissa Santa Cruz for vice president stood to present a socialist and internationalist alternative, to raise the level of political discussion and discourse within the working class, and to insist that the task which confronts not just American workers, but ordinary people everywhere, is the building of a revolutionary socialist leadership and the taking of power by the working class. Our program, as Comrade North raised in the final election meeting of the SEP, is not one that changes because of elections. Our program is no different on November the 4th than it was on November the 2nd. And our program, because our program is based on an historical understanding and assessment of the strategic experiences through which the working class has passed. And that analysis is that workers need to fight for their own class and independent interests and perspective through its own class action. In conclusion, I just want to quote from Comrade North's, part of Comrade North's speech on November the 1st. As he said, we are not miracle workers. We don't make promises. We don't promise instantaneous cures. We are confronting a vast historical crisis upon which hinges the fate of humanity. There is no easy solution. We are a revolutionary party that tells the working class the truth. If the working class is to prevent the establishment of the most horrific dictatorship the world has ever seen, it must take up the fight for power. Those who are listening and who agree with his perspective must make the decision to build a movement that is fighting to put an end to capitalism, base itself on the lessons of history, and has confidence in the strength of the working class. And it is on that note and on that comment that I would like to also echo Comrade North's invitation and urge that anybody who supports this perspective, who supports this program, must make the most important decision of your life, and that is to join this movement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cheryl. Before I invite our next speaker, I would just like to invite the participants, the attendees, to ask questions or make comments in the chat window. Before you do, make sure that you select the drop-down menu and click all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, the other attendees will not see your message. So now I would like to invite our next speaker, Comrade John Braddock, who is a member of the International Committee for 22 years. He's written widely on New Zealand and the Pacific for the World Socialist website. John will discuss New Zealand's foreign policy positions. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Matty. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone listening from around New Zealand and elsewhere. As Comrade Cheryl has just outlined, this meeting is being conducted under unprecedented and historic circumstances, with the US, the centre of world imperialism, in the midst of an election of historic proportions. In New Zealand, in recent days, there has been some commentary about the possibility of a Biden presidency being more favourable to New Zealand interests. There is an important distinction to be emphasised here. When the media talks about New Zealand interests, they mean the interests of New Zealand capitalism and New Zealand imperialism, and not those of the mass of the population. We make our assessment of the international significance of a Biden presidency from an entirely different standpoint, that of the interests of the New Zealand working class, the workers in this region and internationally. On this, there should be no illusions. Biden is in no sense a lesser evil. He has always been a warmonger, and it was the Obama administration, in which he served as vice president, that began the pivot to Asia and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were the beginning of war preparations against China. There was growing criticism of Trump in Washington over the past year that Trump was too soft on Beijing. The military and intelligence establishment, for which the Democratic Party speaks, have made clear that the key issue regarding China currently centres on the suppression of Chinese development in high-tech areas. The United States, at the direction of the Pentagon, has recently imposed a crippling ban on China's leading computer chip maker, the SMIC Corporation, following earlier decisions to cut off the telecom giant Huawei from its US chip suppliers. Trade war has become a tech war, and increasingly a full-scale economic war. The dominant feature of the international situation is the drive by the imperialist powers, led by Washington, towards war. America's ruling oligarchy aims to use its overwhelming military superiority to reverse its historic economic decline. The coronavirus pandemic has greatly accelerated this tendency as the US and other imperialist countries seek to divert their intense and insoluble domestic tensions onto an external enemy. Concrete military plans for war against China are far advanced. For years, the US military has been encircling China and staging provocative exercises in the region, including in the South China Sea, near North Korea, and over the island of Taiwan. The prospect of a disastrous war between nuclear-armed states is growing ever more present. The Pacific is once again becoming a key geostrategic battleground, as it was in World War II. New Zealand and Australia, both members of the Five Eyes Security Alliance, are seeking to shore up their military and economic dominance in the Southwest Pacific, with American support, to counter Beijing's growing influence. Washington demands that all its allies in the region put themselves on a war footing. This week, Ardern described New Zealand as a calm oasis in a chaotic world. But New Zealand can no more isolate itself from the current maelstrom than it could from the imperialist carnage of the 20th century's two wars. Ardern refused to criticise Trump's blatant attempt to steal the US election.
Apologies, everyone. We seem to be losing John. While we get John back, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Tom Peters. We'll come back to John when we get him back. So Tom Peters is the leader of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and a World Socialist website writer who has written extensively on the political, social, and economic events in New Zealand, Asia, and the Pacific. He will detail the Ardern government's attacks on the working class and the fight for the socialist program of the International Committee of the Fourth International in New Zealand. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Matty, and yes, welcome to everyone taking part today. And I hope we can return to John later. Just to remind everyone, please, we welcome all of your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those after we finish these speeches. Well, John and Matty also referred to Jacinda Ardern's statement on Thursday that as she was watching the US election unfold, she thought to herself, quote, "New Zealand feels like a calm oasis in a chaotic and difficult world." New Zealand is typically being portrayed this way in the media throughout the world as though it's a great exception with a kind and caring government that is held up as a model for the United States and Europe and Australia and many other parts of the world. Now, Ardern made this comment during a speech to the Business New Zealand lobby group, which was her first major speech after being re-elected. But she then went on to actually contradict herself, saying that, quote, "The coming years will be very difficult, with the global growth forecasts showing the impact of the virus is going to be with New Zealand for some time, both in terms of managing its spread, but also recovering from its economic impact," end quote. In fact, there is no end in sight for what is the most severe breakdown of capitalism that the world has seen since the 1930s. Even though New Zealand has so far escaped mass deaths from COVID-19, the Ardern government has no progressive solution to this crisis. Its response, like others, is to protect the booming stock and property portfolios of the rich at the expense of the working class. And in that speech, Ardern announced an extension of interest-free loans for businesses and an extra $300 million worth of, quote, wage subsidies for employers. She's presented that as a way of saving jobs, but in fact, it's just another handout to the corporations, including those that have sacked thousands of workers. These sums add to the tens of billions of dollars that Ardern's government has already handed over to businesses, and the $100 billion that the Reserve Bank has said it will print as part of its quantitative easing program to buy government bonds back from the private banks and ensure their profitability. This process is creating not only enormous social inequality, but a huge pile of debt that will have to be recouped through austerity and through savage pro-business restructuring at the expense of the working class. One is reminded of Leon Trotsky's observation 6 weeks before World War II that the capitalist system had reached a state of impasse and that, quote, "I do not see any normal, legal, peaceful outcome from this impasse." He predicted wars and revolutions and remarked that, quote, "The programs of the present governments seem now, at least to a man who observes them from the side, as child's play on the sloping side of a volcano before an eruption." So there is no calm oasis in this world today any more than there was in 1939. The ruling class is advancing this nationalist myth about New Zealand in order to dull the consciousness of workers and to blind them to the real situation that they confront. And the truth is that society is sitting on the side of a volcano. The number of coronavirus deaths, as Cheryl referred to earlier, has passed 50 million. Sorry, the number of cases has passed 50 million, with more than 1.25 million deaths. And this is accelerating rapidly throughout the world. We're in an unprecedented economic, social, and healthcare crisis, which has exposed the complete failure of capitalism to protect human life and living standards. All throughout the world, governments have used the pandemic as a pretext to give trillions of dollars to the banks and corporations. The ruling elites are placing profits ahead of lives by allowing the virus to run rampant with the homicidal policy of herd immunity. The capitalists are bringing far-right forces to positions of power and stripping away democratic rights. The indifference of Donald Trump and countless other leaders to the mass death and to the impoverishment of tens of millions of people is pushing workers and young people to the left. We wrote on the World Socialist website recently about the annual survey conducted by the Victims of Communism Foundation, which is a right-wing anti-communist organization in the US, which found that support for socialism among people aged 16 to 23 has increased from 40% to 49% just in the past year. There are no similar polls in New Zealand. However, there was a poll by the Ipsos organisation just before the 2017 election, which found that 64% of New Zealanders believe the economy is rigged in favour of the rich, and 56% believe that politicians do not care about people like them. The ruling class is deeply afraid of these developments. Jacinda Ardern and New Zealand are therefore being put forward as some sort of proof that there is still hope that the capitalist system can be progressively reformed if you just have the right leaders in charge. This slide has some of the headlines, just a very small selection of headlines praising Ardern. Well before the pandemic, media commentators were hailing her as firstly for being a woman, then for having a baby while in office, and for her allegedly compassionate response to the Christchurch terrorist attack last year. They described her in the New York Times as the antithesis to Donald Trump. But things have reached a new intensity this year with the claims that New Zealand has defeated the pandemic, and the Financial Times, without any sort of irony, described her as a saint. After the Labour Party's landslide victory recently, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives in the US, told a New Zealand reporter, quote, "Your Prime Minister is a source of great pride to all of us." So it's not surprising that with this barrage of positive media coverage, that many people have illusions about Ardern. And several of the comments that have showed up on our Facebook posts express surprise that we are referring to this government as a right-wing government. Some even say this is a socialist government, and they wonder why socialists are fighting among themselves. You know, why are we attacking them? The vote tally released on Friday, the final vote count for New Zealand, shows that Labour got exactly 50% of the votes. And that support has been spread all across the country, with Labour winning a majority in all of the red areas in this slide. Although it's important to note, there was still a very significant rate of abstention, which was about 1 in 5 eligible people who chose not to vote for any party. And that reflects the fact that among vast layers of workers and young people, Labour and National are both seen correctly as big business parties that really don't care about people like them. Some of Labour's support is bound up with claims that Ardern has prevented large numbers of deaths with the early lockdown in New Zealand. But in fact, the government imposed a lockdown in late March because of the intense nervousness that exists, that if they didn't take action, they were going to face an independent movement of the working class. There had already been wildcat strikes in Italy, in Britain, and the United States, among other countries, where workers took action in defiance of the union leaderships. They shut down factories in many cases in order to protect lives. And that was a very real prospect in New Zealand in March. Healthcare workers started a petition online demanding a lockdown, and they quickly gained more than 70,000 signatures for that. The government, with the support of the trade union leaders, had been insisting that schools should remain open, that was safe, and however, they sensed a dangerous shift in the working class and they changed their position. But then after imposing this lockdown in late March, the government then reopened the economy well before it was safe to do so. And it has promised big business that there will be no return to a nationwide lockdown in the event that there is a significant new outbreak of COVID-19. The Labour Party declared in August during its campaign launch that this was going to be a COVID election. And they did that in order to shut down discussion about basically every other issue. The political elite and the corporate media has avoided talking about the danger of war, the threats of dictatorship in the United States, and the record levels of social inequality that exist in New Zealand. part of the reason that Labour won such a large majority, as we've analysed on the World Socialist website, is because of the crisis that exists in the National Party, which had 3 separate leaders in the months leading up to the election. And much of the support for Jacinda Ardern's government came from wealthy suburbs, where the average house price is over $1 million or over $2 million. For example, in the case of Herne Bay, which is New Zealand's most expensive suburb in Auckland. And these are places that were thought to be impregnable strongholds of the National Party. And the reason that they gained this support is that the government has protected the interests of the super rich in New Zealand. Their response to the pandemic, as I said, has been essentially the same as that of the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. Unprecedented handouts to the banks and the major corporations. Meanwhile, companies that have received these subsidies and cheap loans have slashed the wages of their workforce, and in many cases, like Air New Zealand, the Warehouse, Fletcher Building, and Sky City Casino, just to name a few, they've sacked thousands of workers. As John outlined, this is a government that began in 2017 with the crucial support, or as John was going to outline, I should say, because he was cut off, but it began in 2017 with the crucial support of the right-wing nationalist New Zealand First Party and with the backing of the United States. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters, when the government was formed, claimed that it was going to restore capitalism's human face. And Jacinda Ardern even made herself the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, promising to address poverty and homelessness. All of that proved to be a complete fraud. The government folded up its Kiwi Build housing program, which was supposed to build 100,000 so-called affordable houses. It only built about 500, and those were sold at grossly unaffordable market prices. The indices of the social crisis are getting worse all the time. House prices have gone up over the past 3 years by 27%, and rents have gone up by 15% or more in some working class neighborhoods. The number of families on the public housing waiting list has quadrupled to more than 20,000. During the election campaign, Ardern blatantly lied when she said that the government had reduced child poverty in the final debate with Judith Collins and on numerous other occasions. In fact, it still stands at nearly 1 in 4 children living below the poverty line, and the Treasury has admitted the numbers who are in material hardship will, quote, rise sharply due to the present economic crisis. Median incomes have already fallen by nearly 8% this year alone. Demand for food bank charities has doubled or tripled in some of the major centres. Unemployment, it's just been announced, has gone up to 5.3% from 4% at the start of the year. But that official figure is manipulated because it only counts those who are actively looking for work. The underutilization rate, which includes people who cannot get enough hours of work to make ends meet, stands at 13%. And there are about 12% of working age people who are receiving some form of welfare. So this is a social crisis that is unfolding here, and that is getting worse all the time. And all of this was entirely predictable in 2017. Ardern is a typical capitalist politician. She was groomed for years to take on a leading role in the Labour Party. She trained in the office of Helen Clark during the Clark government. And in 2006, she worked in the office of Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister, who's largely responsible for the criminal war in Iraq that killed at least 1 million people. So Ardern has always rejected any association with socialism when she's been asked about that. She's described herself instead as a pragmatic idealist. Since the election, Ardern has been echoing Joe Biden's appeal that he's been making to right-wing Republicans, as Cheryl described. Ardern has been similarly saying that she's not going to take the support of National Party voters who switched to Labour for granted. We will be the government for all New Zealanders, she says, and that they're going to strive for consensus. Really what this is a reassurance to the business elite that Labour is going to govern on their behalf. Now, despite the government's substantial majority, I think it would be a huge mistake to see this as a stable government. It is clearly anticipating a resurgence of class struggle as a result of its right-wing policies. After the election, the Labour Party went into 2 weeks of discussions with the Greens before announcing the new government. Labour was determined to form what is essentially a coalition with the Green Party, as Ardern said, because this was needed to guard against instability in Parliament. The two Green co-leaders have been given ministerial responsibility for climate change and for homelessness. In other words, they will be responsible for the government's pro-business policies in both of those areas. The only reason that this government can be paraded with any credibility as a left-wing government is because of the progressive fig leaf provided by the Green Party, but also the trade unions, and perhaps most importantly, New Zealand's pseudo-left groups such as the International Socialist Organisation, Socialist Aotearoa, and groups and publications like the Daily Blog and in the United States, Jacobin magazine. Nothing more clearly demonstrates the vast gulf that separates these organisations from genuine socialism than their embrace of the Ardern government, which has strengthened the alliance with the United States, attacked the rights of immigrants, and is overseeing a historic assault on working class living standards. Jacobin magazine published an article by an official from New Zealand's First Union, which described the New Zealand election result as, quote, a win for the whole political left, one replete with possibilities for further victories. Similarly, the International Socialist Organisation has asserted that Labour's victory reflects a shift to the left and, quote, there is new space now for movements outside Parliament to exert real pressure, end quote. These are the same arguments that these organisations and similar organisations advance in the United States to chain workers to the Democratic Party and to Joe Biden by pretending that this government that he's going to lead can be pressured to the left. And the arguments are just as bankrupt in the case of New Zealand. These tendencies write as though the Ardern government's attacks over the last 3 years and the social crisis that is now worsening has never took place. And in fact, they pretend that things have improved. Jacobin gave examples which they say, quote, prove that working people, Maori, and environmental campaigners can win under the incoming Ardern government. They pointed to the nurses' strike in 2018 and the teachers' strikes in 2018 and 2019. These were historic nationwide strikes that involved tens of thousands of workers on a scale not seen in New Zealand for decades. And they were part of an international wave of strikes and protests as workers all over the world sought to fight back against the brutal austerity measures imposed since the 2008 financial crash and against the rise of anti-democratic methods of rule internationally. According to Jacobin, the nurses in New Zealand achieved immediate concessions. This is a quote, the final settlement dramatically improved nurses' pay and added hundreds more staff to hospital wards, end quote. That is completely false. In New Zealand, as in every other country, what happened in the nurses' strike was that the union bureaucracy strangled the movement and worked with the assistance of the pseudo-left organisations to subordinate the working class to the Labour Party's capitalist agenda. The New Zealand Nurses Organisation is a prime example of this. It rammed through a sellout agreement in 2018, which included a 3% pay increase, that's well below the real increase in the cost of living, and a promise for a 2% increase in staffing, which I think equates to about 25 nurses per hospital, which is not enough even remotely to address the crisis of understaffing. Union officials justified this by echoing the government's lie that there was no more money to fix the crisis in hospitals and in schools. This also left the country totally unprepared for the pandemic, and it's widely recognized that any serious outbreak will quickly overwhelm the public health system if it's not brought under control. The NZNO imposed this sellout agreement in the face of significant opposition from nurses who had rejected numerous proposed settlements. Some nurses established their own Facebook group in order to make their own demands, particularly for decent levels of staffing, and to try and put pressure on the union bureaucracy. We argued, the Socialist Equality Group argued, that workers had to completely break away from the union and establish new organizations, rank and file committees, controlled by the workers themselves. And workers are beginning to form such organizations internationally, with the political assistance, in many cases, of the Socialist Equality Parties throughout the world. Teachers in the United States and Australia, and auto workers in the United States, bus drivers in London, are all taking initial steps to try and organize independently of the union bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the unions in these countries are enforcing unsafe conditions, trying to force teachers back to schools amid the pandemic, and helping to impose redundancies, speed-ups, and other attacks on working conditions. In New Zealand, the union bureaucracy is fully collaborating with the tens of thousands of redundancies that have been announced this year, as they did following the 2008 financial crash, telling workers that this is all basically inevitable. These are not workers' organizations. They're adjuncts of the corporations and of the Labour Party government. They're staffed by members of the upper middle class who have a stake in defending capitalism. The Nurses Union, for example, has dozens of staff making more than $100,000 a year, and that is by no means an exception. So the organizations, the pseudo-left groups, such as Jacobin, the ISO, Organise Aotearoa, and others, are oriented to this affluent layer of the middle class, and they hope that the Labour government is going to provide a greater role for the trade unions in this second term in enforcing a tax on the working class over the coming years. Groups like the ISO and others falsify the entire history of the Labour Party in order to pretend that it can somehow return to being a reformist party. But the reality is, firstly, the Labour Party is a capitalist party and always has been. And like all the social democratic parties throughout the world, its response to globalization decades ago was to abandon any policies of social reform. The 1984 Labour government of David Lange launched a major wave of pro-business restructuring, privatizations, tax cuts, and mass redundancies, similar to what Margaret Thatcher did in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. It should be added that these commentators who are celebrating the Labour Party victory do not mention its alliance with the US, its increased funding for the intelligence agencies, the police and the military, and its brutal anti-immigrant policies. There are thousands of immigrants who have lost their jobs, who are not eligible for unemployment, and thousands more whose residency applications are being endlessly delayed and who fear that they may be forced to leave the country. Despite all the glorification of the government's response to the Christchurch massacre, the truth is that that event was the product of decades in which Australian and New Zealand governments, including the Labour parties in both countries, joined in the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and demonized and scapegoated immigrants and Muslim people for all the social problems created by capitalism. The massacre of 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch demonstrated that New Zealand is by no means immune to the danger of the extreme right that is being promoted throughout the world. As Ardern ramps up the assault on working class living standards, the danger is that it will open the way for extreme nationalist forces to exploit the discontent that exists in the population, particularly under conditions where Ardern is wrongly identified as left-wing, and there is currently no genuine socialist and internationalist party opposing the government. After all, Donald Trump was the product of 8 years of brutal attacks on the working class in America and of imperialist war under the administration of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. We anticipate that workers will come into direct conflict with this government sooner rather than later. And indeed, this is already happening. It's already happened over the past 3 years. These are a couple of recent events, a protest over healthcare cuts in Christchurch, and the mass protest in Auckland in solidarity with the protests in America against the killing of George Floyd. But this opposition to the government and to social inequality and police brutality has to acquire a conscious socialist orientation. History, including the history of the rise of fascism in the 1930s, demonstrates that without revolutionary socialist leadership, even the most extreme, even the most militant workers' movements will end in defeat. As Trotsky stressed in the founding program of the Fourth International, the crisis of mankind reduces itself to the crisis of revolutionary leadership. This leadership has got to be built. It has to establish firm roots in the working class in advance of revolutionary struggles that are going to erupt, just as they did in the last great breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s. And that is why joining our party is the most urgent political task facing those in this meeting who agree with our analysis. Join us and fight to build the Socialist Equality Group into a Marxist party, the New Zealand section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, that can lead the working class to establish its political independence from Labour, the unions, and their pseudo-left allies. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have many questions. I think we will now return to John if he's back with us.
Thank you. Yes, my apologies for the technical problem. I was at the point of talking about the formation of the Ardern government in 2017. Her government was formed when the US ambassador publicly intervened in the wake of that election. Ambassador Scott Brown, who was a Trump appointee, gave 3 extraordinary media interviews to pressure the incoming government to more openly align and integrate with Washington. As a result, the far-right anti-immigrant New Zealand First Party formed government with Labour and the Greens, with whom its anti-immigrant and anti-Chinese policies were more closely aligned, instead of National, which got more votes. Ardern gave New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters the key roles of Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and the party's Deputy Leader Ron Mark, a former soldier, who was made Defence Minister. In office, Peters led the government's Pacific Reset policy, designed to strengthen New Zealand's neo-colonial role in the region, while Labour committed tens of billions to upgrade and expand the military to integrate into US war plans. A 2018 defence policy statement labelled China and Russia the main threats to global order, echoing the Pentagon. The Greens are complicit in all this. They have postured repeatedly as opponents of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but when it comes to the unprecedented increase in military spending, they support it and claim it will be used for disaster relief and other humanitarian purposes. New Zealand's ruling elite has for an extended period been caught between the demands of Washington and its militaristic confrontation with Beijing on the one hand, and the importance of the Chinese trading relationship. The Helen Clark-led government of 1999 to 2008 restored relations with Washington by sending troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. This was continued under the National Party government, which also invited the US military to train in New Zealand and expanded New Zealand's role in the Five Eyes massive surveillance network, all with bipartisan support from the Labor Party. At the same time, the John Key-led national government significantly strengthened trade and investment ties with China, which became New Zealand's largest trading partner. Since 2007, two-way trade has increased from 10 billion to 30 billion New Zealand dollars. The Fraught Balancing Act became increasingly untenable as the US ramped up its economic and military encirclement of China under President Obama's pivot to Asia strategy, demanding that US allies fall into line. After 2016, Trump announced trade war measures against China and stepped up military threats. Ardern, while keeping the public in the dark during the election, has signalled New Zealand's ongoing commitment to the anti-China build-up. A press release 2 days after the election announced the redeployment of New Zealand Air Force planes to Japan to support sanctions against North Korea. This places New Zealand's military on the front lines should war break out between the US and North Korea or China. This event was followed by extraordinary police raids, again just days after the election, on the homes of 2 members of the New Zealand-North Korea Friendship Society, a charity that sent about $2,000 to North Korea to purchase pandemic supplies such as face masks. This small organisation is absurdly accused of breaching United Nations sanctions against the country's nuclear program. Further, Radio New Zealand reported on October the 27th that Washington is to deploy US Coast Guard cutters to American Samoa and Guam. The US National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, declared that China is, quote, threatening the rules-based order that's kept the peace since World War II, unquote, which forces the US to act. According to O'Brien, the armed high-speed vessels will, quote, enforce US laws, unquote, in partnership with other Pacific nations such as Samoa, the Cook Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea. O'Brien told Radio New Zealand he had spoken personally with Ardern about the move and that Ardern had said she was, quote, pleased with the idea of more US law enforcement on the high seas, unquote. Again, this discussion about a ramped up US presence in the Pacific took place entirely behind the backs of the population during the election campaign. Nanaia Mahuta, who has replaced Winston Peters as Foreign Affairs Minister, told the media immediately following her appointment that she was still, quote, getting advice on issues like the Pacific reset and the growing influence of China, unquote. She praised the huge contribution made by Peters, a clear indication that the anti-China policy begun in the last term will be ramped up. The collapse of support for the opposition National Party following months of inter-party turmoil, including 2 leadership changes leading up to the election, is also bound up with the question of China. The party has been repeatedly attacked in the media for its links with Chinese business interests. The academic Anne-Marie Brady has been a major player in the anti-China campaign and elevated as something of a celebrity in the media. Her widely publicised report, published days before the 2017 election, claimed that National was beholden to Chinese business interests and alleged, without any evidence, that 2 Chinese-born MPs were agents of the Chinese Communist Party. Brady, whose work is promoted by NATO and the Washington think tank, the Wilson Center, is not so much a researcher as a pro-American propagandist. She recently made a series of sweeping and unsubstantiated claims that New Zealand researchers were assisting the Chinese military with joint academic initiatives. Several academics claimed that Brady had effectively smeared them as Chinese agents, forcing the University of Canterbury to announce an investigation of her work in August. Like Jacinda Ardern, A wide range of liberal and pseudo-left commentators promote the fraud that New Zealand can somehow steer an independent course in the growing global turmoil. Last week, the prominent activist John Minto, writing in Stuff on behalf of the Palestine Solidarity Network, welcomed Mahuta's appointment and declared, quote, ethics and morality are desperately needed in foreign affairs and defence, unquote. At the same time, many of this pro-Labour Party milieu have enthusiastically joined in the anti-China campaign. The trade union-funded Daily Blog, for instance, has agitated for years against Chinese immigrants and backed Anne-Marie Brady's demands that the intelligence agencies investigate Chinese-born Jin Yang and expel him from Parliament. In fact, New Zealand has always allied itself with the leading imperialist power of the time as a quid pro quo for a free hand in pursuing its own neo-colonial interests in the Pacific. Labour and national-led governments alike have committed troops to wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere on that basis. There is no neutral path in the coming period of capitalist breakdown, which will be not dominated by major conflicts between the main imperialist powers. In a perspective on January 3rd, entitled The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins, the World Socialist website noted, quote, there was not a single day during the last decade when the United States was not at war. Military operations not only continued in Iraq and Afghanistan, new interventions were undertaken in Syria, Libya, Yemen, and the Ukraine. The United States is determined to maintain its dominant position, whatever the financial costs and the consequences in terms of human life. The perspective further declared, quote, the movement towards a third world war, which would threaten mankind with extinction, cannot be halted by humanitarian appeals. War arises out of the anarchy of capitalism and the obsolescence of the nation-state system. Therefore, it can be stopped only through the global struggle of the working class for socialism. A new anti-war movement must be completely independent of the Labour Party, the Greens and all their allies, including the trade unions and their pseudo-left supporters. It must be based on the working class and it must be consciously anti-capitalist and socialist. The struggle against war must decisively reject the nationalist conceptions promoted by the New Zealand middle class groups that orbit the Labour Party. There can be no serious fight against war without a fight to defend the rights of immigrants and refugees and for the international unity of working people in all countries. This is the perspective advanced by the Socialist Equality Group and the International Committee of the Fourth International. As other speakers have emphasised, we invite you to study our program, and if you agree, join us in preparation for the coming historical struggles. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So with our main speakers out of the way, we're going to address some questions. If you have a question, please post it down in the chat. Remember to select all panelists and attendees so that the other attendees can see what you are asking. To start with, we have a question from Bianca, who asks, what can be done about New Zealand's COVID-19 Response Act? She compares it to Hitler's actions in 1933. She says if alternative healers were treating COVID patients, we wouldn't have such a crisis. And she asks, do petitions work in changing government policy? So I know that Tom Peters was going to respond.
Thank you. I will just respond briefly. I mean, first of all, we reject that perspective outlined that you know, the lockdown and other measures you know, are somehow a fascist approach that is you know, comparable to Hitler's actions in the 1930s. I mean, we support the idea of you know, there having to be lockdowns as an emergency measure to combat this virus. I mean, that was absolutely necessary, particularly as I mentioned in my report, and under conditions where New Zealand's health infrastructure is totally decrepit, has been run down for decades, and there's virtually hospitals were already overflowing many times in the past year before the pandemic erupted, and people were already dying of cancer and other things because they weren't diagnosed promptly and they didn't get the treatment that they needed. So there's no doubt that if the approach had been adopted in New Zealand, such as has been in the United States or Brazil, many other places, that the virus was just allowed to run completely rampant, then there would be mass deaths, and no one should think that can't still happen. By the way, I mean, there have been several reported instances of the virus escaping from quarantine facilities for returned travelers, and so far that hasn't resulted in any major outbreaks, but it could well do if it's not picked up. This is an extremely deadly virus, and it certainly can't be resolved with alternative medicine. It requires a coordinated international response with massive resources, which is not happening under capitalism. In fact, the profit system and the fact that money has to be made out of any vaccine that's developed, it has to be profitable for somebody. I mean, that is the real impediment to tackling this virus. Anyway, it's so there's. I think that's really all there is to say. I mean, these conceptions that Bianca raises have been promoted in New Zealand. I mean, it's particularly by the extreme right, by groups such as Advance New Zealand, which have gained substantial media coverage. And I spoke in my report about the danger of the extreme right in New Zealand. And that's very real, and they promote the same, deadly herd immunity policy that is now being championed internationally and adopted, really by the bourgeoisie in many different countries. So no, the lockdown was a necessary step, and as I said, it wasn't imposed because of some sort of genius or kindness of Jacinda Ardern. It was imposed because of growing mass demands from below, from the working class, including from experts, epidemiologists, healthcare experts who were warning about the dangers of the virus, so I think those are the main points in response to that. I mean, the government did, and we have criticized some of the aspects of the legislation, such as the ability for police officers to enter anyone's house. That clearly, that is not required in order to contain the virus. So we didn't endorse every single aspect of this legislation, and we do recognize that these sorts of laws imposed under capitalist governments will be used to strengthen the powers of the police state, and that is happening all throughout the world. But that does not mean that we reject the need for lockdowns and for certain extreme measures to control people's movements and to stop the spread of the virus. One other point, though, is that those measures have to be accompanied, as the World Health Organization has stressed. You can't solve everything just through lockdowns. It has to be accompanied by a massive increase in spending on healthcare to actually properly equip the hospitals to distribute personal protective equipment and to be able to deal with outbreaks, and also to strengthen contact tracing measures and be able to stop any outbreaks that occur. So all of that has not been done in any country, including New Zealand, to the level that it has to be. There's still a crisis in hospitals, as I mentioned in my report. So that's why this virus really cannot be tackled, and it is a revolutionary question. Millions of people will die, are already dying, and that will continue because the resources that are needed to stop it are monopolized by the super rich. That's the issue, bluntly. So I'll leave it there for that question. But thank you for your question.
Thanks, Tom. So we have another question that's come in from Andrew. He asks, what are your thoughts on the outcome of the euthanasia and cannabis referendums? So John or Tom, would you like to address that?
Yes, I'll address that. Well, firstly, on the euthanasia question, we opposed both of the questions that were put forward. On the euthanasia question, it is, of course, or should be, a basic democratic right of people to make their own decisions about if they want to die. However, the important question is the context that this has been put forward in. We are living, as Thomas just mentioned, through a period of a massive COVID crisis where people in their thousands are dying. And one of the political perspectives that has been put forward is that through herd immunity and other measures, the elderly and people who are vulnerable can be basically allowed to pass on, that they somehow are a drag on the economy, that they take up too much health expenditure, and that really the money and the emphasis should be put elsewhere. And so what is emerging here is a discussion of the question of living and dying being carried through under the circumstances where the health system, the care of the elderly is dominated by the demands for profit for the corporations and big business. And it's under these circumstances, the issue of euthanasia, of the taking of life, is really, it's a reactionary conception. The fact that it was put forward in New Zealand by the right-wing ACT Party is very significant. The ACT Party has over the last year been promoted, partly because the leader has promoted this this policy, and it fits in with a turn to the right by the entire ruling elite. So the question of euthanasia cannot be discussed outside of the general crisis of New Zealand capitalism and internationally. Our position on the cannabis referendum, again, was that we oppose this. There are a number of issues pertaining to this. It was put forward as a progressive measure so that young people would not be victimised by the law and so on. But again, it's being put forward in a particular situation where young people are now coming into struggle, political struggle against the capitalist order. The promotion of cannabis use is a detraction from that. The fact that it was put forward as a referendum question alongside the election and under an intense international political crisis was a detraction from the big political questions. The issue of making cannabis legal and more widely available is not something that we support at all. The measures, authoritarian measures against youth, working class youth, will continue and strengthen despite any attempts to liberalise cannabis use. So the big questions, the essential questions of the political and economic crisis are at the forefront of this, and are conditioning all of the responses on these questions. But Tom might have something to add.
No, I think, I mean, you've addressed all the main points that we have there, and we have written about, particularly about the issue of euthanasia on the World Socialist website, which I encourage people to read, and perhaps that article could be posted in the chat if someone can find it. Perhaps, I mean, perhaps I will go ahead and answer this other question that's come through. I can read that out and answer it. Is that okay? I'll just go ahead and do that. So we have a question from Sudarshan, which I think is very important. I'm a migrant worker here and have been running behind their so-called points system, which changes literally every couple of months for almost 5 years now. That's the points system for eligibility to immigrate to New Zealand. Although I have been facing many issues like these, my immediate problem is me not being allowed to reunite with my partner for over a year. This denial has been going on ever since before COVID, especially if you're not culturally similar, according to Immigration New Zealand. Now, COVID is being used as a cover to deny families reuniting, despite allowing international students, film crews, billionaires, and many other privileged people to come here. I would really like to hear your thoughts and any actions we can take against this. I think this is a particularly brutal aspect of the New Zealand government's actions over the past year. It has, I mean, there are about 30,000 applicants on the waiting list, most of whom live in New Zealand. These are applicants for residency. And they have been endlessly delayed, as you say, since well before COVID-19. And COVID-19 has just been used to, you know, really enact very cruel policies towards immigrants, including separating families by, you know, not allowing migrant workers to return to New Zealand. For example, you know, we've spoken to a worker in India who had been working in New Zealand. She had to go home to see her mother who was sick, and then the pandemic erupted and she wasn't able to return to her life in New Zealand. And as you say, there's a massive double standard being imposed here, because the government has allowed film crews to come in here, and you know, particularly rich individuals have been allowed in. So it's a, you know, it's a class question, and the working class in New Zealand has to defend the rights of immigrants, and that's what we stand for in the Socialist Equality Group and the Socialist Equality Parties worldwide. We stand for, you know, the rights of all workers to live and work wherever they need to, wherever they want to, in order to have a decent life. And to have all of the same rights as New Zealand citizens. And so we are, you know, we're very keen to talk to people such as yourself, and to organize, you know, to write and expose some of these conditions which are being ignored for the most part in the media. The plight of migrant workers doesn't sit well with the narrative of New Zealand being a kind and caring country. And it shows really that the Labour Party has adopted and shares the extreme right-wing attitude towards immigrants that the New Zealand First Party is best known for. But it's, you know, it's the same thing is happening all over the world. In Australia, the United States, Europe, immigrants are being scapegoated as unemployment rises, as the social crisis, you know, gets completely out of control. And that is a deliberate policy, really, by every ruling party. in every capitalist party to try and divide up the working class and to prevent any sort of fight back. And I would say, as John mentioned in his report, that people such as the Daily Blog, which is funded by a number of trade unions in New Zealand, are totally complicit in this. They have been agitating against immigrants for years and calling for jobs for New Zealanders first and all that sort of thing. And I would just point out, for those who aren't aware, that New Zealand is a country of immigrants. And currently, I believe, according to the census, that about 1 in 4 people in New Zealand was born overseas. So this is a significant portion of the New Zealand population. And if there is going to be any working class struggle against austerity, against militarism, against the attacks on democratic rights, it has to be done by uniting immigrants with those born in New Zealand. There's no other way. And so for the ruling class to stop that from happening, they really have to attack immigrants. That is their strategy. So I'll just leave it there. That's our view on that issue.
Thank you, Tom. Before we take our next question, I believe Comrade Cheryl has some comments to make about the cannabis referendum.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I mean, I agree very much with the points that John has raised in regards to euthanasia and also the cannabis legalisation issue. There's one point that I also want to highlight, particularly in regards to the question of cannabis. As a revolutionary party, as a Marxist party, we appeal to the highest consciousness of the working class. Our task, our responsibility, our fight is to raise the level of consciousness, to raise the level of awareness amongst young people, amongst the working class. The role of cannabis, the role of drugs, including alcohol, is to deaden that. It is to create a situation where there is a false reality, where young people, instead of being able to develop their minds, their knowledge, their consciousness, their political understanding and awareness, are actually encouraged to turn towards deadening them. And that is one of the reasons why we oppose the whole dissemination and distribution of drugs, the legalisation of drugs, because it is certainly, and we also oppose the criminalisation of young people and of others who take it. It is used absolutely as a means of carrying out assaults against the working class, against young people, of criminalising them. But also, I mean, one aspect of the legislation itself and the discussion that took place around the referendum is that the police could actually be doing far more effective policing work than running around with cannabis. And this was very much supported by the police union and other sections of the state, because they want the police to be oriented and able and free to carry out their work in a more effective manner. And of course, the state, the role of the state, is not some neutral arbiter. These are not forces who exist to create peace and tranquility within society. The state is, as Engels raised and Marx raised, is a body of armed men whose role it is to carry through the oppression of the class, the oppression by the ruling class of the working class. And so the state and the role of the state is used as a mechanism of class oppression. And the fact that that this referendum was raised, not insignificantly, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a crisis. Many young people have literally had their lives put on hold. They don't know what their future will be. Some have not been able to carry out their education. Whatever jobs they had, most of which were part-time or casual, have been lost. Their ability to turn towards a career has been stopped. Their plans for marriage, for children, their lives have been put on hold. And this is the result of a pandemic that governments, including New Zealand governments, were warned about, had been told about. They did nothing to prepare for them. And it is the working class, and in particular young people, who have borne the brunt of the impact of this. And while, as Comrade Tom outlined absolutely correctly, that outside of a vaccine, outside of treatment, the only mechanism which has been able to be effective in controlling and eradicating the virus is lockdowns. But of course, under capitalism, the lockdowns themselves are used as also a mechanism of strengthening the state. But the lockdowns are absolutely essential. We oppose herd immunity. We oppose, the let it rip scenario and narrative which Johnson and Trump and other governments are carrying through. But what we fight to do is to raise the level of consciousness, is to raise people's awareness, and the development of the dissemination of drugs is essentially bound up with that.
Okay, so we have another question from Jay. Does the SEG feel it is possible, with the strength of capitalist media / social media voicing anti-left sentiment at anything even centrist, that it can gain traction in the New Zealand political scene? And I think that's a really important question, because it relates to our orientation, which is, to the working class. I think John and Tom, you could comment on that, and also the role of our website, the World Socialist website.
Well, I think the question does point to the role of the media, which is to, in the current period, has been very much to promote in New Zealand Ardern, and in the US, if those people who've been following the election coverage in the US, the surge of commentary behind Biden now is that the media does play a central role in promoting not only capitalist property relations, but particular sections of the ruling elite. Now, in opposition to all of that, we have developed over a period of 22 years the World Socialist website as the voice of the working class, and listeners who have come to this webinar through the World Socialist website will know that it has just undertaken a major development, a complete redesign, that is not just a matter of the face of the publication, but an intensification of the politics and the defence of the struggle, the carrying forward of the struggle of the working class. So the World Socialist website is not simply presenting a commentary on the unfolding political situation, but is fundamentally connected with and part of the struggles of the working class. And it is that gives it its objective character and its scientific character. It is a partisan publication that defends the interests of the working class in opposition to the capitalist media, and the fact that it is now gaining vast increase in its readership, despite the attempts by Google and other outlets to censor the World Socialist website, it points to the intersection of the objective struggles of the working class with the subjective political development of the Revolutionary Party itself and the Trotskyist movement, and that's why it's central and critical to the work that we do, our intention is that workers everywhere, all around the world, it's an international publication, can turn to it to develop their political understanding, their historical understanding, and their political orientation in the unfolding developments.
Okay, so a significant comrade from our Australian party, Nick Beams, would like to speak now. He's a long-standing member of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia and a regular contributor to the World Socialist website on economics. So welcome, Nick.
I just wanted to comment on the question of the lockdown issue. Let's trace through how it developed. As other comrades have announced, any measures have spoken of, any measures that were announced by capitalist governments, limited lockdowns and so on, were taken in response to opposition in the working class. But the policy itself was dominated by corporate elites and the interests of the ruling class. What did they do? They imposed very limited measures, and the most important question for them was to ensure the flow of profits. And so they organised, as I said, limited measures, but then immediately proceeded to bail themselves out all around the world to the tune of trillions of dollars, to the extent that the Fed and other central banks now are the basis of all the financial markets around the world. They pump in trillions of dollars. And of course, once they'd done that, the question of return to work, herd immunity, came to the fore and was promoted by every government in order to ensure that workers kept working and kept pumping surplus value back into the coffers of big business. Now, what would a socialist response be to this pandemic? It would be the following. It would to institute the necessary measures to deal with the pandemic. What would that involve? It would involve the closing down of key set of non-essential industries in order to prevent the spread of this pandemic, the development of massive resources to health and other conditions, and so on. Now, that didn't take place. Why not? Because a socialist measure would mean closing down these non-essential industries and paying workers who have employed in those industries sufficient to maintain their living standards and so on, while this necessary societal response took place to this danger. Why was that not done? Because such a policy would involve making decisive inroads into the profits of the capitalist enterprises. Where would the money come from? Well, much of it could come out of the pockets of Mr. Bezos, for example, and all the others who benefited out of the COVID-19 pandemic. They benefited to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. That's why it was never implemented. And so, of course, the lockdowns as imposed under capitalism have necessarily created resentments, because everyone knows, well, it's established now scientifically, and we base ourselves on science, and we have to emphasize this point. The greatest spreader of the virus is workplaces, and now we're also seeing schools, educational institutions, and so on. So the policy that was determined by the capitalist governments was a deflection. They deflected the opposition, and as soon as that was out of the way, they got back to the making of money out of this pandemic at the expense of the masses of the population. The only way in which the society can deal with this question is absolutely bound up with making decisive inroads, the expropriation of the major corporations, the banks, to provide resources of society which have actually been created by the labour of the working class in the whole of society, not by the Mr. Bezoses, not by these others, but by the workers who create all wealth, the utilisation of that wealth for the defence of the conditions of people in society. That's our policy. Yes, the pandemic would have to be dealt with, but dealt with on a scientific basis, and a scientific basis means making inroads and providing the resources from the looting that is taking place by the capitalist class. So in essence, as we've said many times on the World Socialist website, in the final analysis, the pandemic is not just a question of science and medicine. Above all, it's a question of politics. And it's a question of an orientation of the working class to mobilise the resources that it has created, to take them out of the hands of the capitalist class and utilise them for the benefit of the population as a whole. That's our policy, and that remains our policy. This danger has not passed. It is increasing and intensifying, and of course can engulf very rapidly countries such as Australia and New Zealand, which so far, more by good luck than good management, have so far been able to escape its effects. But the danger has by no means passed, and the necessity for the policy that we've outlined, rank and file committees to control health, the expropriation of major corporations, the mobilisation of resources to deal with this health threat very much remains.
Thank you, Nick. So we have another question from Jay. Does the SEG see COVID as having stolen the collapse of capitalism, and now a faulty system can be ignored for a few more decades? So Tom or John?
Well, yes, if I understand, the question is basically asking, is it the case that the COVID-19 pandemic has basically just distracted everything from the collapse of capitalism, well, as I think he's saying in a follow-up to that, the question is, is it this economic depression will be blamed on COVID, whereas most economists saw depression coming since the last economic collapse? That's correct. I mean, it was predicted in 2019 and earlier that there would be a global financial crash because of the vast amount of the vast speculative bubble, basically, or bubbles that had been created because of the response to the 2008 financial crash, where governments just, lowered interest rates in the central banks to record lows, and, through quantitative easing, gave trillions and trillions of dollars to the banks and to all of the financial institutions, to all of the criminals who had caused the 2008 crash in the first place. So all of that was leading up to another financial disaster. And then the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. And in response to that, governments, as I said earlier, have given trillions more dollars in the form of bailouts, which vastly eclipses their response to the 2008 crash. No, it is the answer to your question. It's not our position that that this is somehow going to distract from the crisis of capitalism, or that I guess governments will trick people by just blaming the downturn on the pandemic. certainly they are trying to do that, including the Ardern government in New Zealand. Everything, all of this unemployment, the mass redundancies, wage cuts, and so on is already being blamed on the pandemic and presented as though this is just inevitable and natural and there's nothing we can do about it, almost as though it's a natural disaster. But it's not, I think. And just following on from what Nick has said, there's vast resources available that could be used to address this crisis, and working people are not stupid, and they can see that. They can see the vast inequality in society, and that is being exacerbated not so much because of the virus, but because of the response to the virus by the ruling class in every part of the world. That's the issue, and I don't think that people will allow themselves to be duped by, when their relatives are dying from COVID-19 and they are being, suffering a major decline in their living standards. People are not going to accept the answer that, well, this is just unfortunate. It's got nothing to do with capitalism. There's nothing that governments can do about it anyway. No, this is going to accelerate vastly the radicalization of the working class that was already well underway over the past couple of years. And we can confidently predict there will be a further eruption of class struggle. If anyone would like to add to that.
Well, if I could just add one point. In the perspective on the World Socialist website on January the 3rd that I quoted from in my main report, the decade of socialist revolution begins. We laid out there, or the World Socialist website laid out that the coming decade was one in which the contradictions of capitalism were erupting. And that the working class was coming into struggle internationally against inequality, poverty, the threat of war, all of which were sort of rapidly increasing. Now, we anticipated the development of crises. Now, the COVID crisis, in a sense, the form that it took was unexpected. It was something of a surprise, but the fact that this crisis erupted this year in the wake, really, of our prognosis, simply underscores the fact that capitalism itself is responsible for the development of these crises. I mean, the threat of such pandemics have been predicted for many years by scientists. And of course, the ruling elites internationally have completely ignored the warnings, concentrating on the need to prop up profits and so on. So the fact that a crisis such as this has emerged is not a surprise. It's simply the form that it took is one that was unexpected. So what we have put forward, that this is akin to the shots that opened up World War I, is important. It was the World War I didn't begin and end with those shots, but it was the build-up of the contradictions of capitalism leading to the war. That the assassination of the Archduke simply opened the door, and the issue of the COVID crisis is as we have said, a trigger event that is doing the same thing now under the conditions of capitalism that is entering a whole series of crises, and this won't be the last.
Okay, so this will be the final question, I think, due to time. But do you think modernizing Jay is asking, do you think modernizing by avoiding Marxism would aid the cause? i.e. Stiglitz putting forward some pretty solid economic theory. So Tom or John?
It's not entirely clear what you mean by modernizing, Jay. I guess you may be referring to increased automation and so forth, which is undoubtedly happening. Will that aid the cause of the working class? Well, no. I mean, what it does is it shows the necessity for a new and more advanced form of social organization and the eradication of the profit system. Because under capitalism, those improvements, really cannot be used to their full potential to improve the lives of workers. And again, the pandemic is a perfect example of that, because the world has the resources to address this. It has the expertise in terms of science and research and so forth. We know what to do, but none of that can be mobilized because of the profit system and the system of the nation state system of competing countries that really stymies all progress. Similarly with automated production, that is under the present conditions, the result of automation is massive redundancies. New Zealand has examples of that in the meat industry and other industries where robots have largely replaced people. There are many examples of that, but under present conditions, yeah, it just means that workers who are no longer required are thrown on the scrap heap. So I think the Marxist position is that capitalism and the development of production, the productive forces under capitalism, lays the basis for and raises the need for a more rational form of social organization. And in that sense, the modernization of technology is paving the way for socialism, but it obviously requires a revolution. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but if anyone else would like to have a go, please feel free.
Yes, just I thought the question might be raising the issue of whether there was a form of economics outside Marxism that could explain and provide a way forward for capitalism under the coming period. And the answer is no. I mean, there's bourgeois ideology and there's Marxism. And there isn't an in-between ideology. Now, one of the issues that is arising in the current period is that there are various bourgeois economists who are being presented as left-wing, who are putting forward various theses about how capitalism might find a way out of the crisis, that there is some good form of capitalism that can be found and developed, and it's completely false. There are various popularizers, economic popularizers. One who comes to mind is Varoufakis, who's very prominent. Now, Varoufakis, of course, was part of the Syriza government in Greece that betrayed the Greek working class. He quit and then has set up another organisation to try and reform the European Union. And you know, he presents himself as a critic of capitalism, but what they avoid is the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which are bound up with the commodity production, the exploitation of labour, and the crisis of the working class. So I think if Jay was asking whether there is a sort of another form of economics that one can reach for aside from Marxism and aside from classical Marxism and Marxist political economy, then the answer is no. We base ourselves on the entire history of Marx, on the lessons of Das Kapital, and you know, the various economic reformers. And there are many of them now who are being brought forward to try and find a way that capitalism can modernise, is completely false. Thanks,
John. So briefly before we wrap up, we're going to take a couple of comments on this from Nick Beams, who is an economic expert. So he will join us.
Just on the question of Stiglitz in particular, there is a very deep divide between these so-called left economists and Marxism. We've experienced a very vast change going back over 40 years in the structure of capitalism. And that was starting particularly the late 1970s, early 1980s, the turn to what was called neoliberal economics, the abandonment of the policies of the post-war boom, in which living standards rose for the working class, Australia, New Zealand, US, major capitalist countries, and even some so-called lesser developed countries as well. And we had the policies of Reagan, Thatcher, and so on, the focus on the market, the accumulation of finance, and so on. Now, the position of Stiglitz and Varoufakis and many others is that this was all a change of the mindset of capitalist politicians. Suddenly, there was a change in economic outlook, in ideas, that brought forward this program, which viciously attacked all the gains of the working class of the post-war period, and a rollback of all of those gains. I mean, just to give you one example, the real wage of American workers is now less than it was in 1973, 1974. And that's a process that's repeated itself all around the world. Now, the fundamental difference and issue of Marxism against this perspective is, no, this was not a change of mindset by capitalist politicians. The Reagan, Thatcher and the Longy government in New Zealand, the Hawke-Keating government in Australia, which followed in their path, this was a response to the deep-seated objective contradictions of the capitalist mode of production itself, the ending of the post-war period, the decline in profit rates that took place that occasioned the ending of the post-war boom, and that a vast restructuring had to take place, which arose not from the minds of politicians. Their minds were, and their outlook was a reflection and expression of the objective contradictions within the system itself. And so what is now put forward by Stiglitz and by many others is that if only we can sort of turn the clock back, change their outlook, get kinder, gentler capitalist politicians in power, then all the destruction of the last 40 years, and it's been vast, can be reversed. That's the fundamental point of opposition. And we deal with that. Naomi Klein is another who comes to mind. We have articles on her on the World Socialist website, on Stiglitz. I urge you to read these issues, examine this question, and what it illustrates is that, no, the situation can't be reversed by trying to change the mind of capitalist politicians, but overthrowing the capitalist profit system on which they are based. And that can only be carried out by the working class. That's the only way to, because in this period, we have seen a vast development of the productive forces, but all those resources, all that wealth has been siphoned into the hands of the corporate elite and away from wages, social conditions, health services, education, everything else to bolster the coffers of the banks and the corporations. So it's not a change of mindset, it's a change in orientation of the working class and understanding that there is no reforms possible. The choice today is not between reform and revolution, but between revolution and counter-revolution, which is being prepared and deepened worldwide.
Thank you, Nick. So we do need to start wrapping up. You can buy literature from our publishing arm, Merriam Books. Recently, we have Why Are They Back? The appointment of Adolf Hitler in 1933 as Chancellor of Germany was the outcome not of an election, but of a political conspiracy involving a small number of senior military and government officials headed by General Paul von Hindenburg. Its horrific consequences were World War II, the Holocaust, and the destruction of tens of millions of lives. We also have The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by David North. 100 years after the outbreak of World War I and the Russian Revolution, none of the problems of the 20th century, devastating wars, economic crises, social inequality, and the threat of dictatorship have been solved. In fact, they are posed even more sharply today. We also have our statement of principles. The SEP statement of principles outlines the basic conceptions of the SEP, in New Zealand, the SEG, and the foundation for membership in the party. Socialism and the fight against war, build an international movement of the working class and youth against imperialism, and another pamphlet, the World Socialist website and the defense of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Julian Assange has just gone through a major sort of kangaroo court. So we are, we have been among the most important defenders of Assange and freedom of speech. So you can contact us. Our details are on screen. Socialist Equality Party @gmail.com. On Facebook, we have facebook.com/Socialist Equality NZ. Twitter.com/SEG New Zealand. You can donate if you're a New Zealand resident to the Socialist Equality Group NZ, and our bank account number is there. And if you're an international attendee, then you can donate by going to wsws.org/donate. And we'd encourage you to donate. We need help to build a party, to continue running meetings like this one. And once the pandemic has subsided, to run meetings in person, to build a serious party that can fight for the working class. So I'd urge you to join the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, the Socialist Equality Party in whichever country you are in. And with that, I think we can conclude. I hope everyone takes care. Thank you for attending, and have a good evening.